And what you're looking at is a poster from the New York Historical Society, who, thanks to Washington Irving and the Knickerbockers, started to be promoted in America. So St. Nicholas is eventually going to morph into Santa Claus, but that takes a long time, and that's really another story. So in this period, there were no Christmas cards, and they didn't gain in popularity until the 1860s and 70s. So the period I'm talking is very different. There was no wrapping paper. Gifts were not wrapped. So this is the period of the 1830s to the 1850s, when the female abolitionists really play this role in promoting and developing Christmas. They played a key role. So who were these women? And you're seeing some images. I'll introduce you left to right. Grace Bustle Douglas, an African-American woman from Philadelphia. Above her is Abby Kelly Foster from here in Massachusetts, where I'm located. Bottom, Angelina Grimke Weld, the only one of two Southern women involved in the abolitionist cause. And then on the top right, Lydia Marie Child. These female abolitionists, who were they? They were mainly from the upper and middle class families in America. They were both Black and white, and they were both from the city and the country. And the role they play is something that's still with us today, and one of the oldest traditions we have in America, and that is the Christmas fair. What you're looking at is an image from the Christmas fair in my hometown, Nahant, Massachusetts, on the North Shore. And I want to show you through this presentation how they played a major part in promoting Christmas. And you'll learn about these Christmas fairs or bazaars. As I said, one of the oldest traditions still with us today. Now, starting in the 1830s, to finance the abolitionist cause, women organized Christmas bazaars that sold donated gifts, many of them handmade, that trumpeted anti-slavery messages to promote emancipation. And you're looking at a broadside from one of them in North Abington, Massachusetts. Now, these fairs took place throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England. But Boston's fair, which I'll talk about extensively, becomes the largest and the most well-known fair. But let's set the stage for what these female abolitionists are getting into. And that has to do, what was the role of women in the 19th century? The cult of domesticity was a philosophy that sought to define gender roles in the 19th century. Women operated in their own separate sphere. That regulated gender roles in American society. The cult had held that a woman's place was in the home, where her superior virtue was to create a strong, morally uprising and uplifting environment for her children and husband, whereas a man's place was in the more corrupt and violent world of work and public affairs. Women were equated with virtue and purity, and middle and upper class women devoted time to helping charities. Now, that was accepted for them, but not necessarily speaking in the public. Abolitionism would be one of those areas that women would move into. And more women began using their roles as defender of morality, literally took to the stage to speak against slavery. This was for many men, and you're seeing that in this image, and women, controversial and not without incident. What you're looking at is a print showing British-born reformer Frances Wright, who toured the US in 1829. That year, an artist published this cartoon making fun of Wright. It depicts her standing near a table giving a lecture, but she has, as you can see, the head of a goose. The title says, Wright deserves to be hissed. According to this artist and many others, women should not speak in public, and the public should not care what she has to say. So this is the area that the female abolitionists are, the era that they're living in. The early 19th century, though, saw a shift for women in the lower middle class and working classes in the urban centers, particularly of the Northeast, as they entered the workplace, as you can see here. Now, there were some professions like teaching that were acceptable. For lower class women working in factories, this meant supplementing family income by working in industrial mills, or they may work as domestic servants or vending on city streets. So this is clearly a shift. Now let's just put abolitionism itself in context. Abolitionism in America goes back to the 17th century. The American beginning of abolitionism as a political movement is usually dated from 1831, and that is when William Lloyd Garrison publishes the first issue of the Liberator. And we'll talk more about Garrison in just a minute. But I have on the slide just a few notices of different anti-slavery groups that might be all men, or they could be integrated, and they could also be integrated with African Americans also. Now, organizations included groups such as the Ladies' Reliefs of Negro Slaves, which was formed in 1825 to create outrage for atrocities occurring on plantations. This group accomplished their goal by publishing pamphlets. In 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was established, and that's one of the main societies in all of America. And I want to show you this image of one of those anti-slavery meetings. This is on Boston Common. That's Wendell Phillips. The account that goes with this image that you're looking at is not pro-abolitionism. And it's talking about, it's talking quite a bit about that in the commentary on the bottom. So not clearly everyone was for abolitionism. And let me give you an example of one society. The Salem, Mass. Anti-Slavery Society was founded in Salem, Massachusetts in 1832. It was established by and for free Black women. It was one of the first female abolitionist societies founded in the US. And a group of women in Salem organized this. Like most free Black anti-slavery societies, the Salem organization addressed a variety of issues important to free Blacks in addition to the campaign against slavery. It supported secular and Sabbath schools for free Blacks and assisted newly freed or runaway slaves and opposed racial segregation and discrimination in the northern states. So that's a snapshot of one. A larger group was this, and this is a sign you can see in Philadelphia. The Women's Association of Philadelphia sponsored fairs to raise money specifically for Frederick Douglass and causes he was working on. So in the 1830s, these societies sprang up in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, both in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and Providence, as well as smaller towns like Salem or Ohio or Ashburnham, Massachusetts. Now, lacking, and here's another image of the records of the Female Anti-Slavery Society. We're very fortunate that many of these have ended up in museums or libraries. Now, lacking the right to vote in national elections, women sought to influence Congress through their constitutional right to petition. Congress received hundreds of thousands of petitions from women that addressed all aspects of the anti-slavery issue, including the slave trade, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, expansion of slavery in the territories, etc. The petition drives represented women's most important grassroots work for abolitionists in the 1830s. Now, the one on the right in black and white is actually a petition in Washington, D.C. The one on the left is from Oneida County, New York. And you can see all the signatories on that. Now, here we go back to the women. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of their work and all. These women played a key role in the movement from the beginning. And I've mentioned their names to you previously. And I'm going to focus in and talk a little bit more about some of them in detail as we go on, including this mother and daughter from Philadelphia, Grace Boostell Douglas, and her daughter. They were Quakers, and her daughter Sarah's on the right. They met and developed a close relationship with Lucretia Mott and the Grimke sisters, and Jelena and Sarah. This friendship eventually led them to create the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society after they were not permitted to become members of the Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia because they were women. So there was still some discrimination. As I said, some were integrated, some were not. And this is what the women were up against here. It was the Liberator that played a major role in the abolitionist movement. It was started in 1831 and went to 1865, and it was the most circulated anti-slavery newspaper during the antebellum period and throughout the Civil War. It was published and edited in Boston by William Lloyd Garrison. Over 3 decades of its publication, the Liberator, here we see the initials for William Lloyd Garrison, a baronet that might have been one of these fairs. The Liberator denounced all people and acts that would prolong slavery, including the United States Constitution. And here's William Lloyd Garrison, the prominent American abolitionist, journalist, and social reformer, best known, as I mentioned, for the Liberator. He was one of the founders also of the American Anti-Slavery Society and promoted immediate and uncompensated emancipation of slaves in the United States, as opposed to other anti-slavery groups who were for gradual and compensated emancipation. Now, it was Garrison who paved the way for women to have a key role in the abolitionist movement. He saw the power they held morally and the numbers that they could bring to further the cause. So he encouraged in his paper and in his speaking women to create anti-slavery societies and associations, and with them, sewing circles, as you can see here. Typically, in these sewing circles, one member of the group would read anti-slavery literature while the others sewed and made products to sell, both locally at fairs, but also nationally. The largest of these fairs, as I mentioned, is the Boston Fair. Now, I'm going to show you an example of something that might have been made at a fair, and this one actually was. Historian Julie Roy Jeffrey has written, "The subtle mingling of the private and public world suggested by material production did not raise questions of propriety. The entry through fairs of women into the marketplace did. So sewing is okay, that's women's work, but going into the market, now that's a different story, or speaking, as we've already mentioned. And I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about that quilt in just a bit. The female abolitionist societies used tracts that were published separately or in the Liberator to craft their own constitutions. And here you can see just the preamble to one of those. So the women publishing them in the Liberator had access to creating their own, to pull from that. And there were numerous, as I mentioned, societies. This one is in Lynn, Massachusetts, directly opposite where I am today. These women in the Lynn Anti-Slavery Society, quote, purchased materials to be made into articles for the fair held by the Female Anti-Slavery Society of Boston for the purpose of increasing its fund, end quote. These local societies often had their own fairs while still supporting the Boston Fair or as it became to be known, the bazaar, the largest in the country. So women from across New England, the Northeast, and as far away as DC, as you can see in this ad from 1836, contributed goods. And if you look at the list, the Ladies' Society, Cambridgeport, Lynn, Amesbury, New Bedford, and also of Washington, DC, are contributing goods, and those in that amount you see on the right column to these fairs. And here's an ad for the Anti-Slavery Fair by Maria Chapman. Upon consultation and advice with the Friends of the Cause in various parts of the state to hold the fair of 1840 during Christmas week, and to spare no exertions to make it a pleasant and profitable occasion to the good old cause, which every year's effort makes dearer and dearer. That's from the ad. And again, another broadside, again, to show you that these are from all over. This is a broadside for an anti-slavery fair in Victor, New York. These fairs were centered at, they could be at different times of the year, but Christmas seems to have been by far the most popular. You center them at that to capitalize on gift giving. But others held their fairs, or bazaars at the harvest time and so on. Here's another ad where you can, again, if you look carefully in the second paragraph in bold, Lynn Women's Anti-Slavery Societies holding a fair, and they're going to Lydia Marie Child and working with her to promote their fair, but also the Lynn ladies are sending goods to the Boston Fair. Doing these fairs help women develop organizing skills that were key to these fairs, you can see. Here's the Weymouth Anti-Slavery Fair. This is in Massachusetts. And just again, coupling it with a tea party and dance, socializing. This is, I introduce you to Lydia Marie Child. So she was one of the founders of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, which had both white and Black members. And in 1834, the Female Society organized the first of many anti-slavery fairs, specifically to raise money for the cause. And here's just a couple of broadsides I wanted to show you that show you these fairs, announcing them. And look at the last sentence where the articles are coming from, not just coming from other societies in America, but from female abolitionist societies in England, Ireland, and Switzerland. This is 1841. And some of the ads that I looked at, these broadsides or posters, specifically talk about an opportunity to purchase, quote, articles of use and beauty. Among them, the elegant donations of friends in France, Switzerland, and Great Britain, as you saw before, and it says right there at the end there. So these female networks were across not only America, but also across Europe. Now, the first fairs were held in private homes, and the first fair raised about $360. In December 1835, Lydia Marie Child extended the fair to 2 days from a one-day affair at her in-laws' home on Beacon Hill. By the third year, it had grown so big it had to be held at the Artist Gallery Hall. And then it moves to, as you can see in this image here and here, to Faneuil Hall. From January on, women knitted and sewed goods to sell, and abolitionist societies around the state competed to contribute the most items. By 1838, the fair raised more than $1,000, and by 1840, it had shifted, as I mentioned, to Faneuil Hall, as you can see in these images here. And just to show you a couple of the tickets that survive, these are in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society that would have been used to get into the fair. You did pay an admission. to get in. And this is really where the female abolitionist societies, we're talking about gift giving. They're making items to be sold as Christmas gifts. And here, right in the center, it says the Christmas tree. It was at a local fair like this, anti-slavery fair, or Sunday school, that most people of the mid-19th century probably encountered their first Christmas tree. Many of these fairs were sponsored by the female abolitionists who promoted the Christmas tree and the idea of Christmas in their publications, like The Liberator, and this is an ad from The Liberator, and that would be distributed around the nation. And this account for this tree here, which was put up in 1842, looking at the January 1843 issue, when they're reflecting on the fair, they called the Christmas tree a new attraction, a brilliant spectacle. The tree was completely loaded with its Christmas gifts, brilliant with sparkling cones and gilded butterflies, and every branch bristling with wax candles, while the trunk was thickly studded with Christmas lights. And each child who paid admission to the fair was able to take a gift from the tree. So as I mentioned, the first time you're reading about trees first, then if you're seeing them, it's at a bazaar, a Christmas festival, like you see this ticket, or the image on the right is actually from a Sabbath school booklet showing a Christmas tree. And here, a Sabbath school in Middlebury, Vermont, is advertising, come to the Sabbath school and you will see a Christmas tree. Now, the earliest image we have of a Christmas tree is this one you're looking at. It's in the Winterthur collection. It was done by John Lewis Krimmel, who was a German immigrant, and it was painted in the Pennsylvania countryside in 1812 or 1819. But I want you to look at these early images of trees as you see here. This is the first printed image we have of a Christmas tree in America. It's the front piece to The Stranger's Gift, a gift book. You'll be hearing more about those. It was published in Boston in 1836, written by a German immigrant, Hermann Bochum. Now, these trees, like you see here in this next slide, were usually set atop a table and decorated with toys, candy, fruit, ribbons, garlands, and candles. So trees were decorated with handmade items. As you can see some here, presents were tied to the tree with the larger ones below it. Notice they were not wrapped. Several of the Boston fairs, as I mentioned, offered children with their admittance fee to take one of these. The earliest ornaments were generally homemade, and many magazines like Godey's Ladies Book often had articles with instructions for making ornaments. The first glass ornaments appear in the mid-60s, and you see them there from Germany. They were sold individually and not in sets. And I show you just an image on the left with the candles so you can see how they might have been attached to the tree. So this is all new in America. So in the 1830s and 40s, the female abolitionist societies, putting them in their bazaar and making a big deal of it is helping to promote the Christmas tree, but also very much tied with gift giving. It's not till later in the 19th century that you start having the floor to ceiling Christmas trees. And I'm showing you one that belonged to the Upton family when they owned what is now the House of Seven Gables in Salem, Massachusetts. So that is a change there. Now, the female abolitionists also played a role in the use of greenery in decorating at Christmas. Greenery was first used in churches, and what you're looking at is an interior view of King's Chapel, which is located in downtown Boston, all decked out for the holidays. And here you see preparing the church for from Godey's Ladies Book for Christmas. Frances Drake of Leominster, Mass. wrote in 1843, she sent in greens for decorating at the Boston Fair, along with the hand-sewed goods to be sold. So again, the use of greenery in churches and at these fairs is going to promote the use next when it comes a little bit later into homes. It's not until later that you'll see them. And one of the publications I saw from 1882, the one on the left, says, plenty of greens make them pretty and bright with a small outlay, more than flowers. But notice, it's very discreet. They're not totally off the top. The image on the right, there's just a little bit of greenery on the mantle, above the painting, hanging above the mantle. And that's actually a Winslow Homer illustration that you're looking at. So women's groups were, in a sense, cashing in on the growing commercialization of Christmas, which I have to say was there from the beginning. And I love this ad from 1852 because it's not an anti-slavery newspaper. Look at the right, where they're hawking, sterling silver, Parian ware, and all these goods for Christmas. And on the left, there's an ad for the National Anti-Slavery Bazaar. So the one woman wrote about the fair, let's make heaps of money, she had to say. And I want to show you these ads. One of the top is from 1806, and the bottom one is from 1839 that was published in Boston. The one at the top is from Salem, Massachusetts. Commercialization of the holiday, I have to say, was there from the beginning. We think it's something new. It wasn't. As the popularity of the holiday began to grow, businesses began advertising their wares as presents. The earliest advertisements referred to New Year's as often as Christmas. So in these early advertisements, the seeds of the commercialization of the holiday were sown. Such holiday customs as the Christmas tree and Santa Claus, intimately connected as they both are with gift giving, might not have flourished to the extent that they did without some kind of economic impetus. For the first time, mass production of inexpensive goods brought large-scale consumption within the reach of the general public. Merchants were not slow to take advantage of the opportunity, nor were the female abolitionists. And you can see the variety of goods being hawked out by these. And we talked about the commercialization. In December 26, 1850, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in Christmas or the Good Fairy, published in the National Era, she was already lamenting the commercialization of the holiday. This is what she had to say. Oh dear, Christmas is coming in a fortnight and I have got to think up presents for everybody. Dear me, it's so tedious. Everyone has got everything that can be thought of. And there are worlds of money wasted this time of year, getting things that nobody wants and nobody cares for after they got. So again, I showed you this ad a little bit earlier on, again, with the different groups. These fairs, with what these ladies are selling, mostly at this point, handmade, all contributed to the commercialization of the holiday. But these fairs placed women equally in the bustling world of buying, selling, and consuming. This is a floor plan that was printed in the Liberator in 1839 for the anti-slavery fair, and it shows the booths from across Massachusetts and other areas. And it also lists the amount of money that was raised in this 1839 fair over 4 days, which was $1,500. And here you can see, here's a close-up, and you can see all the different towns that are listed. And according to an article written by Marie Westman Chappell for the Liberator in 1839, she describes the fair at length. Quote, an interesting assemblage is gathered within the anti-slavery of women from all parts of the beloved Commonwealth, superintending the sale of various articles of taste, ingenuity, and utility, which they have for months been busied in preparing for the occasion. Never was there a finer display of money's worth, whether the purchaser be in search of the useful or the beautiful. And again, I think you can make out lots of those towns. also including gifts being sent by New York at the very bottom, if you can see that. Nantucket, Taunton, a lot of Massachusetts towns. I want to show you some of the items that were actually made at these fairs. Many of them actually don't survive, or they can't be ascribed to the fairs. What you're looking at is a handkerchief that could have been made for a child. Melissa Abington wrote to the Lowell, Massachusetts Female Anti-Society in July 14th, 1835. These handkerchiefs were produced in the hope, quote, that the sad picture of the suffering these two truly portrayed may kindle in the breast of many a freeborn, happy child a glow of heartfelt sympathy, and cause the tears to flow and the infant offering to arise in heaven in behalf of those downtrodden ones. These printed handkerchiefs were created in relatively small quantities. I believe this is in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. The poor slave handkerchief features text and religious scripture related to abolitionism and the reaction of children to the injustice of slavery. As I mentioned, it's hard to document items that were actually made at these fairs. This quilt was made in 1842 by Quaker women of Clinton County, Ohio, and Wayne County, Indiana. These women had been disowned by the mainstream Quaker meetings due to their anti-slavery activities. Now, Quakers were generally anti-slavery, but again, this is getting with women being involved. Although the Quakers were opposed to slavery, they did not want their members to take an active role in the emancipation movement. The women who made this quilt were all members of the Indiana Yearly Meeting of the Anti-Slavery Friends. Now, I mentioned Abby Kelly before. She was an abolitionist. She was a reformer. She was active in the 1830s to the 1870s. She was a fundraiser, lecturer, and committee organizer for the influential Anti-Slavery Society. She worked closely with Garrison. And I want to show you, this is a quilt that is attributed to Abby Kelly that is in the Worcester Historical Society collection. I think you can just read the text for yourself. And these goods that they're making, the women, obviously, clearly like this, have a message. So you're going to think about them, the message, when you're using it. So many of these, especially the earlier goods, were homemade. Maria Westman Chapman, one of the founders of the Boston Female Abolitionist Society, made this quilt, which is in the collection of Historic New England. The January 2nd, 1837 issue of The Liberator describes articles that have been for sale at the recent anti-slavery fair. Included was the description of this quilt made of patchwork and small stars and a transcription of the poem in its center. The anti-slavery fair held in December 1836 was the third annual fair organized by the women. And here you can see a close-up of that. It says in the hand inked, it says, "Mother, when around your children, you clasp your arms in love. And women, when grateful joy you raise your eyes to God above. Think of the Negro mother when her child is torn away. Soul for a little slave, oh then, for that poor mother pray." And we do know that abolitionist stationery was sold and letterhead was sold at the fair. That's Angelina Emily Grinke Weld with a piece of stationery she purchased at one of these fairs. And it's a letter to Queen Victoria in England, where she wrote regarding human rights and slavery to the Queen. So again, just showing you some of the items from the fair. These are wafers that were attributed to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society around 1850. Wafers were printed with anti-slavery slogans that could be detached and used to seal or close envelopes. And I blew a couple up so you can see you know, what you're actually putting on your letter that other people will read and see. Man stealers, the worst of thieves, in comparison of whom highway robbers and housebreakers are innocent. So strong statements against slavery, as you can see here. And banners were often put up. I showed you one earlier of William Lloyd Garrison at these fairs. And the 1839 Liberator lists the fine linen, from Andover, Massachusetts, likely from the Smith and Dove Company. The Smiths and Doves were active abolitionists and appear frequently in the newspaper. These were two banners that survive in the collection of the Andover Historical Society. A lot of, if you look at what was being sold, a lot were pot holders, practical things that when you use, make you think about what you're seeing on them. That could include pot holders. This one's a little bit later. And this is a list of goods from the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Perth in Scotland to Maria Weston Chapman in Boston in 1850, and listing the goods that the ladies of Perth are sending. They were being, sold as goods, but they're also propaganda items. They captured abolitionist beliefs. This includes in that list, I know it's hard to read, shoes, purses, crochet doilies, a pinafore, bookmarkers, pin cushions, and so on. And this was a common item. These are ridicules, small handbags, usually closed with a drawstring and decorated with embroidery or beading, or like this one in the Victorian Albert collection, printed. And here you see the back printed with a poem, Negro women who sittest pining in captivity and weepest over thy sick child, though no one see thee, God seeth thee. No one pitieth thee, God pitieth thee. Raise thy voice forlorn and abandoned one, call upon him. From amidst thy bonds, for surely he will hear thee. So often with religious connotations in them. Now, these women who were making these purses often did them, as I mentioned, at the sewing circle, and they used these sewing circles, as I mentioned, to read, but they also, in addition to reading the literature at these meetings, would bring anti-slavery pamphlets like you see here to pass out, and would use these bags to hold the material to disseminate pamphlets and so on. This is a pincushion in the Lynn Museum's collection and as I mentioned, the Lynn Female Anti-Slavery Society were using these in their own fairs, but also at the Boston fairs. And here's another. A needle case like this one would have both served as a handy tool and an expression of a woman's political conviction, or anyone's political conviction who used this. This is also in the Lynn Museum's collection. As many as 180 women belong to the Lynn anti-slavery female society. Sorry about that. So marked goods included popular anti-slavery motifs of the day, and there is going to be a shift away from some of this, but it does persist. Here's another example of goods that were sold. We have many indications of samplers, but again, hard to pin which one's down. This one was done by Hannah Bloor. So it's from the first quarter of the 19th century, and it's in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This family tradition says that this teapot was bought at one of the Boston anti-slavery fairs by the James Buffum family of Lynn. It's part of a set that belonged to Buffum, a Quaker from Lynn. In the early 1840s, He befriended Frederick Douglass, who was living in Lynn, and publishes his first autobiography there. So when Douglass does that, he's now revealed his location, and slave hunters come after him. His freedom was at risk. So Douglass was sent to Britain with Buffum. Later, his freedom would be purchased, which in itself was very controversial. This is actually in the collection of the Historic New England. This is another bag that was made, and I want you to look closely at this beaded bag. It's a small brown knitted silk change purse with brown beaded designs. At the front in French, the translation says, "Remember the slave," and the verso has the name of the owner, SS Breed. The Breeds were very prominent families in Lynn, Massachusetts, and this is another item in the Lynn Museum's collection here. You've seen this symbol now a number of times, this image, so we should tell you what it is. It was designed by Henry Weber and modeled by William Hackwood for Josiah Wedgwood, China in England in 1787. The medallion incorporates a number of designs and literary sources. Inspired by the seal for the Society of Abolition of the Slave Trade in England, it depicts an enslaved man kneeling in chains with clasped hands. The phrase, "Am I not a man and a brother?" appears above the man's head, and it is taken from a 1773 poem by Thomas Day titled "The Dying Negro." These medallions were meant to be worn by both men and women, and they might be incorporated into jewelry and sometimes into snuff boxes and in other areas. Here you can see that symbol after Josiah Wedgwood that was used in England by the Birmingham Ladies Society for the relief of Negro slaves. And here you see another adaptation. Copies of Wedgwood's anti-slavery medallion circulated in many different media, as evidenced by this cologne bottle, which was likely produced around the 1830s. Those attending the Boston Fair could find, quote, cologne bottles, old Sevres, scented oils, and Paris soap, as well as pastis perfumeries. And that's from 1849. So again, that imagery is particularly popular. And this ad here talks about, I'm going to read a part, from intelligence received from France and England, as well as various parts of New England, this year's fair will be more brilliant and attractive than ever and combine more articles elsewhere unattainable. So they're talking about these articles coming from all over. The image on the left is an ad I pulled from a Lynn newspaper a while ago, but I want you to notice about 2/3 down, it says juvenile books. The image on the right is actually of a gift book. Books were on the cutting edge of a commercial Christmas, making up more than half of the earliest advertised items as Christmas gifts, writes historian Stephen Nissenbaum. Publishers came up with a new literary genre, a gift book. That's what you're looking here. These books could be designed for various age groups. It might consist of poetry, others might be essays, stories, but they were designed to be used as gifts. And the female abolitionist societies were right on top of this from the beginning. What you're looking at is the Liberty Bell, which was an annual abolitionist gift book, edited and published by Maria Westman Chapman, and it was sold at these fairs, the National Anti-Slavery Bazaar, organized by the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. And it was published almost every year from 1839 to 1858. As you can see, they take their imagery from the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. These books that were being published by the Female Anti-Slavery Society in Boston included authors such as Lydia Marie Child, Wendell Phillips, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Harriet Martineau, the Brit, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucretia Mott, and so on. But they weren't the only female abolition society doing these books that would be sold as souvenirs at the fair and used as gifts. This is the Star of Emancipation. You can see published in 1841 for the Fair of the Mass Female Emancipation Society. This was a non-Garrisonian society, so there were differences. This one, Autographs for Freedom, is an anthology of literature designed to, quote, sweep away from this otherwise happy land the great sin of slavery. It was produced by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society and includes the only published fiction of Frederick Douglass. His story was The Heroic Slave. The driving force behind this was an English woman named Julia Griffiths, and she was a prominent member of the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, and this is a ticket from the Rochester Anti-Slavery Society I just showed you. Now, the female abolitionists are also, doing their fairs at the same time that helping others becomes associated or big part of what the Christmas celebration. Helping those less fortunate. As you see, the abundance at the rich man's Christmas in contrast with the poor man's Christmas. Who was less fortunate than the enslaved? This helped to influence the ideas of helping less fortunate during the Christmas season. A practice still very much part of our tradition today. Of course, that was publicized in Dickens' 1843, A Christmas Carol, and in numerous American publications, which are at the same time promoting Christmas as a family-centered, gift-giving holiday and event. Quote, Christmas is heralded as an occasion for mutual good feeling, family gatherings, and the exercise of those charities so blessed in the sight of heaven. Historian Stephen Nissenbaum wrote, religion failed to transform Christmas from a season of misrule into a quieter pleasure. It was the religion of domesticity that would be represented at Christmas time. And it was the role of women in promoting this domesticity that made a huge difference. So it becomes a family-centered event, as you can see here in this Winslow Homer event illustration. And it was during this time that attitudes towards childhood changed. It now became a special time in one's life. And the central purpose of the family was, yes, to provide for their instruction, but also for their happiness. So two aspects of the late Victorian holiday, remembrance of the poor and increasingly elaborate display and consumption, existed side by side. And I wanted to show you another ad, again, with consumption here, because it shows boxes coming from London and Glasgow, where that little can is on the ad. And in this 1850, it mentions that the Glasgow Female Anti-Slavery Society sent such items as clothing, accessories, and decorative household objects to the Boston fairs. It specifically mentions children and children's goods. Now, typical children's gifts at this time, we saw some of the ads, included sled, games, of course, dolls. This one belonged to Annie Jenkins of Lynn, and she said she was sitting under a tree laden with presents, but the only one I remember and that was of any importance was my beautiful dolly. And just to show you a couple examples of typical toys, this is a jumping jack from that was given to Edith Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth's daughter, from Santa in 1853. But now at the abolitionist fairs, children's card games and games were also, and books were being sold to instruct them on the evils of slavery. So these anti-slavery bazaars sold these to instruct children. What you're looking at is Uncle Tom's card game, or two of the cards from that game. It cost 25 cents, and it was made in Providence, Rhode Island. And That's one. Also, this is a book that was published in Philadelphia in 1846 for the purpose of being sold at the anti-slavery fair in Philadelphia. And it was organized by the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. So again, it's a reader, it's a book that could be used as a gift, but it's also instructing children about the evils of slavery. And here you can read them yourself, what they're saying. D is for the driver, cold and stern, who follows whip in hand. So on. So why did these anti-slavery bazaars end? Well, I can tell you the church fairs, you know, that season is over now with Christmas just coming this week, but those do survive. But the female anti-slavery societies changed because there was a decision in 1858, Maria Westman Chapman decided to cancel the annual anti-slavery bazaar in favor of an annual subscription service. She said, quote, like an old broom, it ought to be replaced. I have invented an instrument to replace it, the 25th Anti-Slavery Subscription Festival. To form so neatly on the old bazaar pipe, the change will only be perceptible for the better. We are such beings of routine that we don't find out so soon as we ought when change is needed. So some people were upset that she decided to cancel the annual bazaar, particularly because she did not consult with other members of the Boston Anti-Slavery Fair Committee. But these subscription services were particularly successful, raising over $2,200, raised $2,200 more than the final bazaar. So they are successful. She felt, and others, that the fairs were passé. She argued that the anniversary was an exclusive invitation-only soiree, which featured music, food, and speeches, and it was more au courant and would raise more funds than the bazaar. And here you're just looking at some information, some ephemera from those. There were also women who felt very strongly that the fair was getting too commercial. There were raffles held at these, and I have found accounts of people railing against gambling as part of these, going against the role. So that did not mean, obviously, the end of anti-slavery societies. It meant the end of these fairs. Fairs were just one aspect. Anti-slavery meetings, lectures, lecturers that went around the country. The money raised from these fairs and then the anniversary subscriptions went specifically to fund Garrison and his organization, and also to sponsor speakers who went across the country and in Europe promoting abolitionism. So that's one way the money was used. I know the Rochester money, specifically Rochester Fair, went to Frederick Douglass to further his abolitionist work and to his cause. But women did not stop being active in these societies. They continued to, as I mentioned, they more frequently spoke. Christmas continued to develop, but so did the cause of abolitionists. Women still contributed to making handmade goods for these Christmas boxes you see being sent out to the soldiers here. This is an ad from, not an ad, but an illustration from Harper's Weekly in 1862 that shows the influence of women. In this engraving, women fulfill many important roles for the war effort, the Civil War, from sewing shirts and knitting socks as part of the Sanitary Commission, to washing clothes for soldiers, as well as for camps, aides, as well as acting as sisters of charity, ministering to soldiers in the field hospitals and helping wounded soldiers write letters back home. Many of these women depict efforts to help and care for soldiers. The Harper's Weekly picture shows the culmination of women's efforts to take a more active and public role in the medical field serving as nurses treating wounded soldiers during the Civil War. So women continued to be active throughout the movement until emancipation. And in the 1830s, many abolitionists who called for an immediate end to slavery rather than a gradual one began to advocate for women's rights as well. You're looking at an image of Marie W. Stewart. Women gained experience as leaders, organizers, writers, and lecturers as part of the anti-slavery movement. The discrimination they continue to face eventually prompted them to band together, many of them, to promote a new separate women's right movement. Women's suffrage in America grew out of the abolition movement to end slavery. Maria Stewart was one of the first women, Black women to speak in public in the United States. She also wrote and published a political manifesto. I wanted to show you that. So what happens to Christmas? Well, St. Nicholas is going to eventually turn in to the Santa Claus on the right we know today in Thomas Nast's famous cartoon of 1881. And, other things will change with Christmas. Santa Claus, I like to say, gets married in 1889 when Catherine Lee Bates of Falmouth, Massachusetts, and later Wellesley University creates the character in 1889. And of course, the Christmas tree is going to continue to morph. I think many of you might recognize the imitation Christmas trees and the revolving lights until we get the Christmas trees of today. Christmas, again, in the 20th century is going to morph and change. New characters will come in. Rudolph makes his appearance in 1839 in a Montgomery Ward booklet as a gift to customers, later popularized in a song by Gene Autry. So what I'm trying to show you is that Christmas is going to continue to adapt and change over time and continues. And starting in 1966, Kwanzaa will be celebrated as a celebration of African American culture, starting in late December, going into early January, culminating in a communal feast that is held on the last day, and it celebrates various African traditions. So Christmas is going to continue to morph and change. What I hope to do, and it's going to continue to morph and change until we get to things like this, Fairfield, Connecticut. But it's the female, my point is here in talking to you about this, is that the female abolitionists played a real role in this development of Christmas, intersecting with things that were already going on, but using their power, especially their moral power, and their role in fostering domestic activities to make Christmas the Christmas we knew it, and the commercialization of Christmas through their fairs, the goods that they sold, and so on. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and wish you all a Merry Christmas. And I have a few minutes to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we have a few minutes, a few questions have come in. Thank you, that was so illuminating and so much. For those of you who need to pop off, I'll just let you know that we will be recording this webinar. So the Q&A portion will be recorded and posted on our website after the fact if you need to jump off and tend to your Christmas or holiday duties. So I think I'll just first share a comment that came in through the Alana Partnerships president, Sean Sawyer. The presentation makes him think a little bit how the sanitary fairs during the Civil War were not only raising funds for the cause, but also providing publicity and brand affiliation, to use a modern notion for artists like church. And that was something that I definitely thought a lot about during your presentation, this idea of commercialization and branding and kind of how much that was at the forefront in the 1800s, when we might think of it as something that is, typical of our modern age. It is in fact something that has been with us for quite a long time. Yeah. Another question that has come in through from Sean is, do you know if there are any activists working on contemporary issues that have adopted the Christmas fair as a fundraiser?
Well, I do know of some that use Christmas. I mean, like a lot of organizations use Christmas as a time to raise money. Think of the Salvation Army, which started in England in the late 19th century. I know of other organizations that use Christmas as an opportunity, again, to raise money. When you say activists, in a sense, Sean, but there's one in my other talk on Christmas I use of the Santa Speedo Run, where people wear their Speedos and have raised now almost $2 million for charity. They do that in downtown Boston. I just happened upon it. So a lot of organizations use Christmas as a time for giving. It's part of that tradition.
Mm-hmm. And another question has come through from Heather Goodridge. Thanks for joining us. Were these women targeted? Did these women face violent acts against them? And I think somewhat related, I had a question as I was listening in. It seems like these abolitionist groups were, very multiracial. And so what was the dynamic there? Were these women targeted, and was there any sort of targeting internally? I think that's something that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's yes. So I do in the Liberator, there are actually accounts of, especially some of the early fairs, not the earliest fairs, but some of the anti-slavery meetings. I was just reading an account where people were hurling insults at the women. And they were threatening them. They were threatening the cause. So yes, women were putting themselves out there, and the dynamics within the Female Anti-Slavery Society, it could be another whole lecture because it's really complicated. Because I've got accounts when Mrs. Redmond, who had been in Boston, was out, and I think it was in Ohio. Was seen walking with white female anti-slavery society women. Other women in the society were appalled that she was walking with an African-American, a Black woman. There were dynamics where African-American women weren't allowed in. There was all this dynamic where Black women were not treated or given the same status as white women. So you have this whole dynamic going on too. It's very, very, very complicated.
Well, with that, another talk, perhaps another conversation that we can have down the line. But thank you so much. Unless there's any other questions that have come through, a really eye-opening kind of take on our current traditions. And I definitely will be looking at my Christmas tree differently, knowing that people were first thinking about it by reading about it than necessarily seeing it. So very illuminating, and thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thank you all. Have a good holiday. Merry Christmas.
You too. Bye-bye.